I was going to start with the investment, but you and I were sitting here, Matt, and I actually didn't know how Seattle Tech Week started. Maybe you can tell that story.
So, the reason this is a fun story is because it just goes to show that ideas can actually manifest themselves into something really special. We were on a family vacation a little more than 2 years ago, and one of my children had been in LA for LA Tech Week in the spring, and the other was going to be doing an event at San Francisco Tech Week in the fall, and they both looked at me and said, "Why isn't there a Seattle Tech Week?" And I'm like, "That's a really good question." So I went back to Madrona the next Monday, and I said, "Why isn't there a Seattle Tech Week?" 6 weeks later, we did the beta version of Seattle Tech Week 2 years ago right now, and now we're on the third year. There's over 250 events. This is a community-driven activity I heard there was like a burger competition today. There's like all kinds of cool things that are going on. And it just goes to show that there was a felt need in this community to have a great reason when it's the most beautiful time of year for people to get together to connect and to innovate. So that's the story.
Thank you for the background. I heard there was a take your dog on a 5K run that I missed, and I totally would have participated in that. Okay, so let's go back 30 years. A lot of the story has been told through the eyes of Jeff, through the eyes of the employees of the company. You do an amazing job telling the story, but maybe not in the public eye so much. So give us a little bit of the inside scoop. Take us back 30 years into the investment.
Well, the actual investment by Madrona was back in 1995. If you want to read a great book that articulates it a little bit more, my partner, co-founder of Madrona, Tom Alberg, wrote a book called Flywheels, sadly just about a year before he passed away. But it tells a lot of the story in detail. And then I got to know the Madrona team about a year after that. And I was working at a big operating business, and we had all these different companies that were trying to figure out their strategy in this thing called the internet because people thought that was going to be disruptive. Got to know some of the early Amazon team. And then, while Amazon struck me right away as a group of high execution-oriented, long-term oriented, focused folks. There was selling books online, right? There started to creep in even to Amazon in the late 90s, this maybe there's a lot of different things we can do. And we looked at this holding company I was involved with. One of our biggest businesses was, believe it or not, Napa Auto Parts. And we spent about 9 months, Andy might remember, the guy that was running Corp Dev at the time was named Randy Tinsley. Some people remember Randy. And we worked really hard and eventually decided, man, this was going to be an absolute disaster. And so we decided not to do it. But it was good first principles thinking over the course of 9 months, got me closer to the Amazon folks and closer to the Madrona folks. And eventually I joined Madrona in 2000.
Awesome. And you've been a steward of the business and an advocate for Andy internally and externally since then. I do want to fast forward to AWS because that's primarily what this is about. I don't think I've told you this, my first experience with AWS, so I was in the fiber and data center and telecom business back in 2004, 2005, and we met with Facebook at the time. It was Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon and Google. And I came up to Seattle and I met with Amazon and they told me what their requirements were for data center space and fiber connectivity. And I just remember saying in the meeting, I don't know what you're doing, but you can't possibly need this much network connectivity and data center space for an online bookstore. There's just no way. And they said, we're working on a little project. And 2 years later, I found out the project was AWS, which was, I had early exposure to AWS through that. But you got to see the launch of that, and you were really close to that in your role at Madrona.
It's funny you tell us, or I'll tell another story related to that, and we'll come back to the launch of AWS. I was meeting with a guy down in Miami about a year ago, and he built this very successful data center business. And in fact, Amazon in the early days they were a customer. And then he got this idea he was going to build a cloud business. And he wanted to come out and talk to Andy and Matt and the team about all this. And he came out here. They were back in the days when the headquarters was up on PacMed, kind of building on the hill. Everything was super duper frugal back then. And he and his team met with them, and they walked out and they're like, we're going to get our butts kicked if we ever try to go into this cloud thing. This was like 2009. We're not even going to give it a try. We're going to stick to the data center business, which was a good decision, as it turned out. So let's wind back to late 2006. This little service, simple storage service, S3, gets launched, really to not any much fanfare at all. And we get to talking with Andy and a few other folks who are like, well, maybe, you guys are targeting the startup community. Why don't we have a little event? And sure enough, there was no budget for little events back then at AWS. Very cultural frugality.
We're still pretty frugal.
I know you guys are. This is a good attribute. I mean, we believe in the, I'm looking at a couple of folks down here that are going to tell you stories a bit, and they are good at this cultural frugality, which is important in startups. So literally Tom, who had a little side project called Novelty Hill Winery, he throws in the wine. Madrona, pays for the cheese and crackers, and we are in this like rundown warehouse on Capitol Hill. And we invite there's about 150 people in the room, startups. And I get up and make jokes about venture capitalists. Easy material, lots to work with. And Andy gets up and said, we got this new thing. It's called Elastic Cloud, Compute Cloud, Cloud Compute, EC2 for short. We got that S3 thing, so you can store stuff and you can compute stuff. And wouldn't that be better than buying a box and putting it in a rack and having to wire it up and make sure it doesn't overheat in your closet? And collectively, we're calling this thing AWS. Then, on top of all that, one of our startups, a little unknown at the time company in 2007 called Smartsheet, Eric Brown, one of the co-founders of Smartsheet, gets up and says, we're using this S3 thing to store files on the rows in a Smartsheet. It's really cool. You other founders should give it a try. That was kind of the first formal launch event of AWS, which last I checked is approaching 120 billion in annual revenue. So pretty amazing to go back to then and see what you all have done with just the germ of an idea, learned from, in that case, I think, internal customers, and then expanded to exploring external customers, starting with startups.
It's awesome to hear you tell that story through the eyes of a customer and a customer story, and account-based marketing's always been super important to us, and not talking about speeds and feeds. And,
I'll tell you one of the fun stories. So this event was, I think everybody thought it was fun and successful. John Doerr from Kleiner, who was on the board at the time, was like, why didn't we do that in Silicon Valley? I'm like, you guys should do that in Silicon Valley. So they did in Silicon Valley, and they took it on the road, and they hooked up. Greylock still had more presence in Boston, and they did a similar event in Boston. It was kind of on a run.
I happen to know John pretty well. You and I have talked about this, but John had talked about the very hard decision that he had when he had to choose between the Amazon board and the Google board. There's good stories in there too. Okay, so fast forward, we went through the beginning, we went through kind of the middle. When I joined AWS in 2017, I already thought the company was way too big for me, actually. And it's incredible the growth that we've seen even just in the last 8 years. So bring us to the present, bring us to your current view. You've seen us over the last 25 years. What are your thoughts on us now? So
I'm going to take a half a step back on that question because it's actually relevant and it has a fun other tie-in to Amazon. In 2012, the dean of the computer science school pulled me aside when we were over there hanging out at the computer science center, said, I got this new professor, you need to meet him. And he's just become the Amazon professor of machine learning at the University of Washington, a guy named Carlos Gestrin. Some of you in the room know him. And 6 months later, after sharing a few glasses of wines, we started a company that was originally called Graph Lab, came to be known as Turi. And they, little by little, started taking off, and by 2016, we had 100 customers, all roughly paying us about $10,000. This was machine learning models embedded in your application to make your app more intelligent. 2016. But, I didn't feel like it. I thought there could be a go-to-market opportunity with AWS. And so reached out to Andy and I said, would somebody from AWS be interested in meeting the Amazon professor of machine learning and his students and what they've built in this company? And Andy said yes. In fact, Andy met with them personally and tried to create a partnership. Somebody else came in, tried to buy the company, did buy the company. So that's where that all went. But that group got bought by Apple. And at the time, there were 5 ML services inside your iPhone. There are over 1,000 today. And so while I'm quite skeptical today, now getting up to present, of Apple's prospects with so-called Apple Intelligence, they actually do a lot of things that you just take for granted that are actually ML and AI powered inside this device and all the other devices you use from them. But where are we going now? Because we've gone from ML to LLMs to agentic capabilities. And a way to think about this, which hopefully is helpful to some of you, is that we are in a revolution that is as big as the last two great economic revolutions. In fact, I would argue it's even greater. That if we think back to the 19th century into the Industrial Revolution, that was the revolution of mechanical machines that helped create automation and gave a lift to humanity through mechanics. And then we had the technological revolution in the 20th century, and it was largely computational machines that helped us out. But it was computation in the kind of classic sense of computation. Today, we're in a different revolution, and I actually believe it's going to happen faster and be bigger than any kind of economic movement that we've ever experienced as humankind. And that is the reasoning revolution. And these reasoning machines, whether it's implicitly things that you're using on your devices, or it's explicitly things that you're interacting with that actually generate code, generate text, generate images, make predictions, make recommendations, or our machines in other ways, is going to transform the way that we work and that we live, and it's already happening. And I think actually all three companies that you're going to hear from tonight are doing that in their own different ways. The third part of this idea of where we are today and why we all want to be more productive. Wouldn't you love to be more productive if you had a reasoning machine that you trusted to be productive with you? Wouldn't you all, love to be more efficient in your day in, day out activities? Wouldn't you, if you're a senior executive and you get bombarded with all of these, reports and data, and you must be information overload. I want to hire some reasoning machines to help me reason over that so I can have the best intelligence and the best judgment that I can have. And then finally, these reasoning machines can do things like understanding, how to interpret, radiology films or, kind of radiology digital records, or understanding what happens inside a cell. There's virtual cell technologies that are basically reasoning machines that can help the great researchers of this world discover cures for autoimmune diseases or cancer, whatever. So this whole idea of reasoning revolution, reasoning machines, and then the final point, coming back to this concept, which is a popular one at Amazon, of reasoning flywheels. And what I mean by the reasoning flywheel, people ask all the time, what's going to be the moat? And for me, that's your ability to take data, put it in the context of information and knowledge, leverage it through the reasoning machines, get recommendations, intelligence, make decisions, take actions, and then you've got new data. And it's that reinforcement learning, which is both a technical concept and just a conceptual concept, around how these reasoning flywheels work, that's ultimately going to be the moat for a lot of the next generation companies, probably many of you that are sitting in this room.
That's awesome. You'd mentioned Andy being involved in the business. We're fortunate to be able to see that because we get to interact with Andy and with Matt. Andy's office is right there. Matt's office is right there. Can you just talk a little bit about I don't know that people see you and I involved with startups and some of the things that you're talking about, but I think it's unfortunate that everyone can't see how involved and how important the work that you do and the work the startups in the room do, and that Andy sees that and Matt sees that, and it is part of our DNA.
I mean, the thing that's hard about being so successful is that it's hard to scale. I mean, at almost any size. And I think that I've seen this with incredible founders that have been able to continually grow and learn and reinvent themselves so they can scale to be successful leaders. We talked about Smartsheet. Mark made an incredible job of that. Sunny Gupta at Apptio. We could go down this list of people, and people I know that are sitting in this room that are going to do that as well. Andy's really the best I've ever seen at this. He's got this incredible ability to range from the conceptual and the strategic and go as far in the details as he feels he needs to go. I would imagine I've sat in some nonprofit meetings with him related to areas that we both have a lot of passion about, education and cancer, and seen him take a 6-pager and go through it and critique it and make everybody feel a little bit uncomfortable, but always in a respectful Andy way. And that's magic. And I haven't seen as much of that with Matt, although we're working on something with cancer and AI now, which is is close to home. But then it's the other part of that is how are you continually bringing the next generation of people along so that they can be in their own person, but also model some of those abilities to range between the conceptual, the strategic, the where do we need to be going, and then also like the details of are we executing, are we getting done, what do we need to amend. I mean, I remember, 3 years ago having a breakfast with Andy talking about what we were seeing in AI, and and he was just so genuinely curious about the things you all had been doing. You've been doing many things for years. I mean, this is long after SageMaker and other things were out, some incredible innovations, but what was coming next? Why was this generative piece, going to transform things in different ways? And I just appreciated his curiosity. I always appreciate it too whenever I brought something to him or others and said, hey, this, I think there's an issue here. And what I loved about it was, he'd always say, and I was prepared, okay, give me a couple specific examples. If you don't have specific examples, the end of the conversation. And I would give a couple of specific examples. He's like, okay, we're going to go look into it. Let's go on it. Let's go take it on. Let's go figure out how to solve that problem. Even at 120 billion here and 700 plus billion in annual revenue. It's kind of even funny to say that. There's this genuine curiosity right from the top.
One of the things that I've appreciated about spending time with you over the last almost decade that we've known each other is your ability to articulate mental models, whether it's the exponential revolution that we're in that's building on top of previous revolutions. But one of my favorite is you I think it was a LinkedIn post or a blog. I don't remember what you did, but the format. But you had talked about what the most important AI model is, this is something I talk about all the time, and mostly am successful in attributing to you, but how the most important AI model is the business model. And ultimately, all of these researchers coming in and building companies and all of the problems that we're solving for customers have to result in a durable business model that creates value. And I'd love for you to maybe spend a little time on that mental model that you have.
Yeah, so this was about, 2.5 years ago, and the idea was, we saw all these models coming out, and there was, you were starting to see some of the more open models, the llama models, companies we don't, talk about as much, although I was talking to the CEO the other day, Mistral, and, companies like this were starting to come out, Cohere with their models. You're like, well, wait, what am I trying to hire the model to do? I mean, effectively, it is a very powerful ingredient in a reasoning machine. But the reasoning machine is reasoning to help me do something. It could be helping me understand a problem better. It could be helping me buy a flight. It could be a travel agent in modern parlances. But it is trying to help me do something. And what our intuition was telling us then is that models were not going to be all you needed, and that the most important AI model was actually going to be the business model. And lo and behold, this was not long after this company came up with this kind of on a lark thing called ChatGPT, which has turned out to be their business model, by the way. By and large, to date. It's going to evolve, it's going to change. And so we think about that all the time, because it's not enough for somebody to be a really competent research lab. Even your closer partners at Anthropic now have really started to accelerate with a couple of different flavors of what their business model is. And to extend this idea to both what's happening on the commercial side and the consumer side, I think that the consumer side, which has been very much advertising centric over the last 30 plus years, is going to become much more buy-side agentically centric. And I'm going to have my buyer's agent that works for me. And I'm going to empower that agent to do different things for me. And that is going to transform the business model. And advertising, at a minimum, is going to look very different than it's looked in the, quote, internet era. And then just on the commercial side, we went through, back when I was first out of grad school, we had this thing we called licensed software, and then, you had a maintenance renewal that you paid like 15% of the original price for the licensed software, which was a perpetual license. I mean, that was the model. And then we had the SaaS subscription model, and now we've seen the consumption model. I think we're seeing some different hybrid models now. And then there's a talk about, well, even if it's a consumption model, what's the unit of consumption? Is it tasks completed? Is it tokens burned? Is it hours of it used? And I think we're in a discovery stage of what that's actually going to look like. And that can be very, very disruptive to incumbents. Just ask Tom Siebel.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. I want to get us to the stars of the show, who are the startups. So I'll leave you with 2 questions, and I'll give you both of them so you can think about it. The first is just, what do you see coming from where you sit, and what's interesting? And then I'll ask you to end with advice for all of us, but especially for the startups in the room.
I was going to ask you for some advice, John, but maybe we'll get to that. There's a whole set of next innovations. So notwithstanding my skepticism of models are not all you need, there's a whole new set of models that are emerging out there. There's a whole area called formal methods. You will undoubtedly be hearing a lot more about it. Companies like Harmonic and Axiom. I know that people inside big cloud computing companies are working on formal methods, and it's an area, if you unpack it, of if I can prove something, then I can verify something, and what is that going to mean to the future of kind of model architectures, model approaches. So there's really cool areas of research along those lines. I think the other thing is how do I harness the expertise of everybody around me? I would love, before I put out a LinkedIn post, to model all of the people that I'm connected to on LinkedIn and ask the question of them without having to ask the question, what do you think about this draft? And have it come back and say, well, if you're trying to reach founders, here's a redraft. You're trying to reach tech executives, here's a redraft to send to them. You're trying to reach, other venture capitalists, here's a redraft of your post. There's companies that do that today, and they're just emerging, but this concept of swarm intelligence is another thing that we're seeing around the corner. And then, of course, I think we're going to see a bunch of agentic capabilities, both in the commercial sense and some really cool multimodal vision and voice-related agentic capabilities, and then in our personal lives, too.
Okay, good. Leave us with advice for founders in the room and everyone trying to build a durable company, whether it's inside a company like Amazon or externally at a startup.
Well, funnily enough, I come back to the takeaway of Flywheels again. And I deeply believe this, that the best entrepreneurs are genuinely curious, which means they're actually humble. You go, what does that mean? If you think you know everything, you are not curious. So the act of humility of admitting you don't know and getting out there and looking for information is step 1. And there's 3 steps to this. The next thing then is that you always get conflicting information. What am I going to do with that? Is this the most important feature we need to build? Is this the tweak to the business model that we need to have? And so this construct of triangulating all of the data, being a good synthesizer, if you're genuinely curious, conflicting data, triangulate it, and then finally, you got to act. You got to decide. The worst decision is no decision. And sure enough, when you act, there some few folks in the room from my alma mater. We had Roger Federer come and give the commencement address. Roger Federer won 80% of his matches. He won 54% of his points. Every point he acted. Every point he wanted to win. Of course, he was pretty good at winning the points that mattered, but you've got to decide, you've got to act, and you get data from that goes right back into curiosity. So this is, I think, the learning flywheel that the best entrepreneurs I've worked with over the years and their teams exhibit in spades.
Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you for your mentorship for all of us. Thank you for your leadership in the for-profit and not-for-profit sector. I know you and I share a lot of common interests there. And thank you for hosting the event tonight.
Thank you all for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.
Do we want to have questions from the crowd? 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Are you up for questions?
Sure.
Okay, who has some questions that they'd like to get answered?
So we learned that 30 years ago, Madrona made an investment to Amazon. Does Madrona, because of the success of that investment, does Madrona do that to date? Or does Madrona only now invest in companies that have established some sort of a reputation, and do you still make small investments?
I love the question. The question for the whole audience is, does Madrona still make these small investments, which today they're called pre-seed investments?
Yes.
It's a term of art that I laugh about because that's not what we called them 30 years ago. The answer is absolutely yes. You're about to hear from a company that we put a couple $1 million into almost 2 years ago, when it was 4 guys and a big idea, and they were all friends from college, and a couple of them had worked at SpaceX, and they thought they could change the world. And that's actually my favorite way and time to invest. And the reason is because you build this trust going through the journey together that can not only build hopefully a successful company, they're not all successful as we know, but you have this amazing journey together and relationship together that, so one of the other folks that I worked with like this is a guy named Sunny Gupta, and we've done that twice. First on a company called I Conclude, then on a company called Aptio. I will be getting in my boat tomorrow morning at 6:30 to drive over to his house to have breakfast with him, to follow up and catch up on things because of that 20+ year life and journey together that we've shared.
Yeah.
So I love that early stage. We love that early stage, and there's a bunch of people in the room that would love to get to know you and talk about what you're doing, and maybe it's a fit.
Okay.
The other thing I will say, though, on this, which is important, is we know that we're going to make, 12 to 15 investments a year, and we're probably going to meet with 1,000+ companies. And so our view is that if you are taking the time to have a meeting with us, we better add some value in that meeting. Because just probabilistically, we're not going to be investing in very many of those really early stage companies because we want to put the full weight of Madrona behind it. So if we're failing at our job of adding value when somebody comes and meets with us, that's not what Madrona is aspiring to do. We're aspiring to help every single meeting that we have.
Okay. Thank you.
Great question.
We have a question over there. Any other questions? I guess that's a question.
Okay, great. Well, let's not wait any longer. Let's get our startups up here. Matt McIlwain, everyone. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, John.